A pregnant girl sold for $1, an outcast mountain man with a hidden past, a ruthless rancher who wants to steal her unborn child. But the secret that connects all three of them is darker than anyone in town could ever imagine. And the final truth? Well, it would change everything. The February wind didn't just bite in Silver Creek. It gnawed, tearing through Claire May's thin shawl like a starved wolf. But the cold was nothing next to the fire of shame burning in her belly, a fire hotter than the one her father stoked with whiskey every night. His grip on her arm was like a blacksmith's vice, dragging her through the muddy street as the town gathered to watch the show. Every face was a mirror reflecting her disgrace. "Look here, folks!" Her father's voice, thick and slurring, boomed across the town square. "See what my worthless daughter's done to herself. Brought shame on my name." He shoved her forward and she stumbled, her hands flying instinctively to the swollen curve of her belly. Tears burned, but she wouldn't let them fall. Not here, not in front of them. Mrs. Peterson, who'd always praised her baking, now clutched her own daughter's hand and hurried away. Miners outside the saloon snickered behind their hands. The whole world had turned its back. "Can't even see her own feet no more," he roared, pointing a grimy finger at her. "Well, I aim to be rid of the problem. Any takers? She's a good cook when she can reach the stove. Starting bid at 2 bits. Laughter rippled through the crowd. The world swam, a dizzying vortex of scorn. She saw Reverend Matthews on the boardwalk, a man who spoke of mercy every Sunday, but he quickly ducked into the mercantile, his piety vanishing like smoke. Her own father was auctioning her off like livestock, and nobody was stopping him. But then, a shadow detached itself from the livery stable. A man stepped forward. He was huge, wrapped in a worn buffalo coat, his face a wilderness of dark beard and weathered skin. It was Levi Briggs, the mountain man, the town recluse. A man they said was half wild, a man who hadn't been the same since his own wife died in childbirth years ago. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at her father. His eyes, deep-set and serious, found hers and held them. And in that moment, the jeering crowd seemed to fade away. Without a word, Briggs reached into his coat. He didn't pull out a handful of coins. He didn't bargain. He pulled out a single gleaming silver dollar. It spun through the air, a bright arc of defiance against the gray sky, and landed with a solid thunk in the mud at her father's feet. The world went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Her father stared at the coin, then stooped to snatch it up, his greed overriding his surprise. He bit it, then grinned a yellow-toothed smile. "Sold!" he bellowed, shoving Claire roughly toward the mountain man. "To Levi Briggs. She's your problem now." Claire stumbled, certain she would fall, her legs giving way under the weight of it all. But she didn't hit the mud. Strong, calloused hands caught her arms, steadying her with a gentleness that was so foreign it felt like a shock. She looked up into Briggs's grim face, expecting to see the same contempt she saw in every other man's eyes. But it wasn't there. There was no pity, no disgust, just a quiet, unreadable purpose. "My wagon's this way," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. His hand stayed at her elbow, a warm, solid presence as he guided her away from the gawking crowd. The whispers followed them like flies, but Briggs didn't seem to notice. He led her to a sturdy wagon, the bed of which was lined with fresh, clean hay and several thick wool quilts. He helped her climb in, his movements slow and deliberate, as if she were made of glass. This simple, unexpected kindness was what finally broke her. The tears she'd held back for so long spilled over, hot and silent. "Hold tight," he murmured, arranging a quilt around her shoulders before moving to the driver's seat. Claire clutched the rough wool, watching as her father disappeared back into the saloon, the silver dollar already destined for the bartender's till. The price of his daughter, the cost of his shame. The wagon creaked as Briggs settled himself. He clicked his tongue, and the heavy draft horses moved forward, their steps surprisingly smooth. As they passed the last buildings of Silver Creek, she saw faces in the windows, watching her go. She was leaving the only world she'd ever known, sold to a wild man for the price of a drink. The road climbed, and the town shrank behind them until it was just a smudge in the valley. The only sounds were the clip-clop of hooves and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Briggs remained silent, his gaze fixed on the mountain road ahead. Claire studied his profile, a rugged landscape of a man. Why had he done it? What did a solitary mountain man want with a shamed, pregnant girl? The stories about him were grim. They said he was haunted by the ghost of his dead wife, that he preferred the company of wolves to men. Had she just traded one prison for another, even more terrifying one? The wagon hit a rut, jostling her. Instantly, without taking his eyes from the road, Briggs reached back with one strong hand and steadied her. "Not much further," he said, his voice softer than she expected. "Road gets smoother past the creek." Her hands moved to her belly, feeling the faint flutter of life within. Whatever waited for her in Levi Briggs's cabin, it had to be better than what she'd left behind. It had to be. But as the sun bled out behind the peaks and the shadows grew long and menacing, a cold knot of fear tightened in her chest. Because no one really knew what happened up on that mountain, and no one would hear her scream. The air grew thin and sharp, smelling of snow and pine. Just as dusk was swallowing the last of the light, she saw it. A sturdy log cabin nestled in a grove of ancient trees. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a warm, welcoming plume against the deepening twilight. A single window glowed with lamplight, a beacon of impossible warmth in the vast, cold wilderness. Briggs brought the wagon to a gentle stop. For a long moment, he just sat there. Then he turned, looking at her fully for the first time. His eyes in the faint light seemed to hold a world of sorrow. "It ain't much," he said quietly, "but you'll be safe here." Those words, so simple, so certain, shattered the last of her defenses. She covered her face, and the sobs she'd been swallowing all day came in a raw, ragged storm. A gentle touch on her shoulder made her look up. Briggs was standing beside the wagon, concern etched into his weathered features. He didn't speak. He just helped her down, his hands sure and steady, making certain her feet were on solid ground before he let go. He led her to the door. As it swung open, a wave of warmth washed over her, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else. Something rich and savory that made her empty stomach clench with hunger. Venison stew. He hadn't just come to town to buy supplies. He had cooked a meal. He had lit the lamp. He had known she was coming. But how? How could he possibly have known? The question hung in the warm air of the cabin as she stepped across the threshold into a new life she didn't understand. Guided by a man who was a complete mystery. The door closed behind them, shutting out the cold and the past. But as she looked around the simple, clean room, her eyes fell on something that made her blood run cold. On a small shelf by the hearth, next to a worn Bible, sat a woman's bonnet, pale blue with faded ribbons, and next to it a tiny, intricately carved wooden rattle. A rattle meant for a baby. He hadn't just been expecting a woman, he'd been expecting a child, her child. And suddenly the safety of the warm cabin felt like the bars of a cage closing around her. The cabin was a world of contradictions. It was rustic, built of massive hand-hewn logs, yet meticulously clean. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jonah Briggs moved with a quiet efficiency that seemed at odds with his formidable size. He gestured for her to sit at a simple wooden table, his face unreadable in the flickering lamplight. Claire perched on the edge of the chair, her hands clenched in her lap, every nerve screaming. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to curdle into a demand. Instead, he moved to the iron stove, ladled the rich, dark stew into a wooden bowl, and set it before her. He added a thick slice of dark bread and a wooden spoon. "Eat," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Then you rest. Long day." He took a seat by the fire, pulling a piece of wood and a small, sharp knife from his pocket. He began to whittle, the blade moving with a practiced grace, shaving off thin curls of pine. He didn't watch her. He didn't speak. He just carved, creating a space of silence that was somehow more unnerving than any threat. The stew was the best thing she had ever tasted. It was warm and filling, chasing away the gnawing hunger and some of the chill in her soul. She ate quickly, nervously, her eyes darting from her bowl to the silent man by the fire. Her gaze kept returning to the shelf, the bonnet, the rattle, the worn Bible. Whispers from town echoed in her mind. His wife, Sarah, died in childbirth. lost them both. The sight of the rattle, so clearly made with loving hands, sent a fresh pang of fear through her. What did he want with her baby? Was he so broken by his own loss that he meant to take hers as a replacement? When she'd scraped the bowl clean, he rose without a word, took it from her, and filled it again. She wanted to protest, to say she'd had enough, but the quiet insistence in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command, delivered without a single harsh word. She ate the second bowl more slowly, the warmth spreading through her, making her eyelids heavy. The day's terror and exhaustion were catching up with her. When she was finished, he finally spoke again. "The loft's up there," he said, nodding toward a sturdy ladder leading to the upper level. "Bed's made. Get some sleep." "But where will you sleep?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Down here," he said, gesturing to a pile of furs near the hearth. "By the fire." He was giving her the bed, the proper bed. After buying her like an animal, he was treating her like an honored guest. Nothing made sense. Every act of kindness felt like a trap she couldn't see, a prelude to a horror she couldn't yet name. She climbed the ladder, her body aching. The loft was small but cozy, dominated by a bed with a thick patchwork quilt that smelled of cedar and sunshine. Through a small window she could see the stars, cold and brilliant in the black mountain sky. She lay down, pulling the quilt up to her chin. But sleep wouldn't come. She listened to the sounds of the cabin below, the soft scrape of his whittling knife, the crackle of the fire, the quiet sigh as he settled into the furs on the floor. She must have drifted off because a sound startled her awake. It was a voice, Jonah's voice, low and murmuring from below. He was talking in his sleep, or so she thought. She crept to the edge of the loft and peered down. He wasn't asleep. He was kneeling by the fire, his big frame silhouetted against the dying embers. His head was bowed. He was praying. "Lord," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief so raw it felt like a physical wound in the room. "I failed her. I failed Sarah. I wasn't strong enough. But you sent me another chance. A test. I won't fail this time. I swear it. I'll protect them both. I'll see it done right." Claire shrank back from the edge, her heart pounding. It wasn't just a replacement he was after. He saw her and her baby as some kind of divine test, a chance at redemption for his own failure. He wasn't just a grieving husband. He was a man on a mission from God, and she was standing in the middle of it. The kindness wasn't a trap. It was something far more dangerous. It was zeal. He would protect her, yes. But what would he do if he thought his divine mission was threatened? What lengths would a man like that go to ensure he didn't fail his God a second time? She lay awake for the rest of the night, listening to the wind howl outside, her mind racing. She had escaped her father's cruel spite only to land in the hands of a man's fanatical grief. She clutched her belly, a new, more terrifying thought taking root. He would never, ever let her leave, and he would never, ever let her child go. Dawn broke in pale, fragile ribbons of gold. Claire woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. She had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, and the mundane, comforting smells from below were deeply disorienting. She descended the ladder to find Jonah Briggs already dressed for the outdoors, a plate of food waiting for her on the table. He nodded a silent, "Good morning," and gestured for her to eat. "I can help with the chores," she offered, her voice small. "I can feed chickens, carry water." "No," he said, the word gentle but absolute. "The doc in town said you're due soon. You need rest." Heat flooded her cheeks. Of course, he knew, everyone knew, but his tone was matter-of-fact, holding no judgment. It was the concern of a caretaker, not a captor. Or was it? "I can't just be idle," she insisted, needing to feel useful, to feel like more than just a vessel he was protecting for his divine test. "You gave me shelter. I should earn my keep." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch, his broad back blocking the morning light. "Your job right now," he said without turning around, "is taking care of that child. That's work enough." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Claire watched through the window as he moved about the small homestead. He hauled water from a creek, his massive shoulders making the heavy buckets look like toys. He tended a small flock of chickens. He began splitting logs for the woodpile, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing in the crisp mountain air. He was a man of immense strength and quiet competence, and she was completely at his mercy. Later that morning, he came back inside. He didn't speak of his prayer or of Sarah. Instead, he pulled a chair up to the table. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Here it comes." "Reckon you're wondering why I brought you here," he began, his eyes on the grain of the wooden table. "Why I paid that $1. "Yes," she whispered. "I had a wife," he said, his voice growing rough. "Sarah. We were to have a child. But the birth, it went wrong. A winter storm, worse than any I'd seen. Couldn't get the midwife. I lost them both." The pain in his face was a canyon carved by years of grief. "I swore then I'd never try again. Couldn't bear it." He finally looked up and his eyes were filled with a burning intensity. "But then yesterday I saw you, standing there with a child on the way, and your own father casting you out. It felt like God was giving me a sign, a chance to do right by a life I couldn't save before." "This life," he said, his gaze dropping to her belly. "That baby you're carrying, it's a gift, sacred, and I aim to protect it, no matter what." Tears streamed down her face. No one had ever called her baby a gift. It had only ever been a shame, a burden, a mistake. Jonah's words were a balm on a wound she didn't even know was still bleeding. But beneath the comfort, the fear remained. His protection felt absolute, suffocating. "You can stay here as long as you need," he continued. "You don't owe me nothing. Your only job is to bring that child into the world safe and sound." 2 weeks passed in this strange, quiet rhythm. Jonah was unfailingly kind. He taught her how to bank the fire, how to bake bread in a Dutch oven, how to tell by the clouds if more snow was coming. He never laid a hand on her, never made an untoward suggestion. He treated her with a deep, almost reverent respect. But she also noticed how he subtly reinforced her isolation. The trail markers leading down the mountain were moved. The spare horse went lame. He always had a reason, but the message was clear. This was her world now. One morning he announced they were out of flour and salt. "Best get to town now," he said. "Another storm's brewing. I can feel it in my bones." The thought of returning to Silver Creek made her stomach churn. But the thought of being trapped without supplies was worse. The wagon ride down the mountain was tense. As they neared town, she could see people stop and stare. Whispers followed them like a foul wind. "Hold your head high," Jonah murmured, his voice firm. "You've done nothing to be ashamed of." He guided the wagon to the general store. The bell above the door jangled, announcing their arrival. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, was there. And so was another man, a man who radiated wealth and arrogance, like heat from a forge. Barrett Sloan, the richest rancher in the territory. Sloan's eyes raked over Claire, lingering on her swollen belly with a cold, appraising look. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice slick with contempt. "If it ain't the mountain hermit and his new pet. Interesting choice, Briggs. Most men don't care for damaged goods." Jonah stepped slightly in front of her, a silent shield. "We need supplies, Mr. Peterson." "Now hold on," Sloan said, stepping closer. His expensive boots clicked on the floorboards. "I've been hearing talk about this baby she's carrying." His eyes cold and gray as river stones fixed on hers. "Seems to me my good-for-nothing nephew was at her father's saloon the night she got herself into this mess. He might have been a drunk, but he was still my blood." The air in the store went thick and cold. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. "What are you saying, Sloan?" Jonah's voice was a low, dangerous growl. Sloan smiled, a predator's baring of teeth. "I'm saying that child might well be a Sloan, and we Sloans take care of our own, even our mistakes." He took another step, his gaze dropping to her belly once more. "When that baby is born, I'll be coming for it. A Sloan child will be raised in a proper house, not a hermit's shack on a mountain." Jonah's hand, which had been resting on the counter, clenched into a fist so tight the knuckles went white. The store was silent, the tension a living thing. Mr. Peterson looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Sloan wasn't just making a claim. He was declaring war, and Claire suddenly understood. Jonah's protection wasn't a cage to keep her in. It was a fortress, and it was about to be put to the test. The ride back up the mountain was a silent, agonizing journey. Every word Sloane had spoken echoed in Claire's mind, a drumbeat of doom. "I'll be coming for it." The casual cruelty, the arrogant assumption of ownership. It was a nightmare she thought she'd left behind in her father's saloon. Jonah's face was a mask of thunderous fury. The reins were white-knuckled in his hands, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. The quiet, gentle man was gone, replaced by something harder, something dangerous. When they finally reached the cabin, Claire slid from the wagon, her legs trembling. She expected Jonah to explode, to smash something, to let out the rage that was so clearly boiling inside him. Instead, he unloaded the supplies with a frightening, controlled precision. He moved with the deadly calm of a gathering storm. Inside, with the door barred, she finally broke. Sobs tore from her throat, doubling her over. She sank to her knees by the cold hearth. "I didn't know," she choked out, the words ripped from her. "I swear I didn't know who it was. My father. He gave me a drink. He said it would make me friendlier." Everything went dark. Jonah knelt beside her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, anchoring weight in her spinning world. "The child is innocent," he said, his voice raw but firm. "And so are you. What was done to you was evil, plain and simple." He took a deep, ragged breath. "And that baby is a gift from God. No Sloane is going to lay a hand on it. I swear on my Sarah's grave, they won't." She looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. The sheer, protective ferocity in his eyes was terrifying and comforting all at once. "But why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" "Because," he said, and the grief in his voice was a bottomless well, "I failed to protect one mother and one child. I will not fail again." Over the next few days, the cabin transformed. Jonah worked from dawn until dusk, his grief and rage channeled into methodical preparation. He sharpened every axe and knife until they gleamed. He reinforced the cabin door with an iron bar. He forged himself in his small smithy. He spent hours clearing sight lines around the cabin, felling trees that offered too much cover. He wasn't just chopping firewood. He was building a fortress. Claire watched him, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. This wasn't just about protection anymore. This was about a coming war. The quiet sanctuary had become a stronghold. One afternoon, a grizzled old trapper named Jim Wheeler passed by, a rare visitor to their part of the mountain. He shared a cup of coffee with Jonah by the woodpile, his voice low and urgent. Claire, standing in the doorway, heard every word. "Sloane's hiring men, Jonah," Jim said, his eyes troubled. "Gun hands from down territory. He ain't just making threats. He's building an army." After Jim left, Jonah didn't speak of it. He just took his rifle down from the mantel, cleaning and oiling it with a grim focus that chilled Claire to the bone. That night, as they sat by the fire, the silence was heavier than ever. Jonah stared into the flames, his face a mask of stone. Claire finally had to break the silence. "Violence won't solve this, Jonah. He has men. The law." "The law?" he scoffed, the sound bitter. "Sloane is the law in this county. He owns the sheriff, the judge, every last one of them. There's only one law up here on this mountain, and I'm it." He looked at her then, and the zeal she had first feared was back, magnified and honed to a razor's edge. "I told you I'd protect you," he said, his voice a low vow. "I meant it. Sloane wants to come up here. He'll find more than a hermit waiting for him. He'll find God's own wrath." A few days later, the first real sign of trouble appeared. Jonah found one of his traps sprung, and lying inside it was a dead fox, with its throat cut. A clear, brutal message. It wasn't about furs. It was a warning. Later that week, Claire was drawing water from the creek when she saw them. Two men on horseback sitting on the ridge opposite the cabin, just watching. They didn't move. They didn't wave. They were just a silent, menacing presence, a promise of what was to come. The mountain no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. They were surrounded, isolated, with Sloane's eyes seemingly everywhere. The winter deepened, burying them in snow, and with every fresh fall, the walls seemed to close in a little more. Jonah taught her to use a rifle. He set up targets, pine cones on a log, and made her practice until her shoulder ached and the smell of gunpowder clung to her clothes. "You need to know how," he said, his face grim as he helped her reload. "If they get past me, you need to be able to protect the child." One night, she woke to the sound of the horses screaming in terror from their lean-to. Jonah was up in an instant, rifle in hand, and out the door before she could even call his name. She rushed to the window, her heart pounding. In the pale moonlight, she saw the silhouette of a massive bear, panicked and enraged, tearing at the lean-to. But it wasn't a random attack. As Jonah fired a warning shot into the air, sending the bear crashing back into the woods, Claire saw it, a trail of meat scraps and blood leading from the woods directly to the horse pen. Someone had deliberately baited a bear, hoping to create chaos, to injure their horses and leave them stranded. Jonah came back inside, his face pale with fury. "They're not just watching anymore," he breathed, barring the door. "They're trying to break us." Claire looked from his grim face to the rifle in his hands, and then at her own swollen belly. Sloan wasn't just going to come for the baby. He was going to destroy everything and everyone in his way to get it. And they were alone, on a mountain that had become their prison, waiting for a war they couldn't possibly win. March clawed its way in, a month of howling winds and relentless, wet snow. The mountain was a world of white, beautiful and deadly. The isolation became a physical presence, pressing in on the small cabin. Jonah was a coiled spring of tension, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, his rifle never more than an arm's length away. Claire felt the baby move constantly now, a strong, insistent life reminding her of what was at stake. One night, the storm hit with a fury that seemed biblical. Wind screamed through the pines, rattling the shutters Jonah had reinforced. Snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet. And in the heart of that raging storm, a sharp, undeniable pain seized Claire's middle. She lay still, breathing through it, praying it was a false alarm. But then another came, stronger, deeper. The baby was coming. "Jonah," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. He was by her side in an instant, his face etched with concern in the lamplight. One look at her was all it took. The grim protector vanished, replaced by a man facing a terror greater than any of Sloane's men. "The midwife," he said, his voice tight. "I have to get Martha Winter." "You can't," Claire cried, clutching his arm as another contraction ripped through her. "Not in this. You'll be killed." "I have to," he said, his jaw set. He was already pulling on his heaviest coat, but as he reached for the door, he stopped. He turned back, and Claire saw a look of pure, unadulterated fear in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the storm. He was afraid of something else. "Martha," he started, his voice cracking. She's Sarah's mother." The words hung in the air, more shocking than the storm's fury. The one person who could help them was the woman who had every reason on earth to hate him, to blame him for her own daughter's death. "She won't come," Claire whispered, the truth of it a cold certainty. "Not for you." "She has to," he said, a desperate edge to his voice. "For the baby." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I won't fail again, Claire. I can't." He plunged out into the storm, and the wind slammed the door shut behind him, the sound like a gunshot. Claire was alone, with only the howling wind and her escalating pain for company. The hours that followed were a blur of agony. She paced the cabin, gripping the backs of chairs, breathing as Jonah had taught her. The fire began to die down, and she struggled to add more logs, her body clumsy and weak. The world narrowed to the four walls of the cabin and the relentless, rhythmic waves of pain. Fear, cold and sharp, began to creep in. What if he didn't make it? What if Martha refused? What if she had to do this alone, and something went wrong, just like it had for Sarah? The journey down the mountain was a descent into a frozen hell. Snowdrifts as high as a horse's chest blocked the trail. The wind drove ice crystals into Jonah's face with the force of sand, and the cold was a physical thing, leaching the strength from his bones. His horse stumbled and fell twice, and Jonah had to fight his own freezing, clumsy body to get it back on its feet. The memory of Sarah's last hours haunted him with every step, her face pale with pain, his own hands helpless and useless. The midwife's cabin, too far away then, just as it felt too far away now. When he finally stumbled onto Martha Winter's porch, he was more a creature of ice than a man. He hammered on the door, his frozen fist making a dull, weak sound. The door creaked open, and Martha stood there, a sturdy woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much sorrow. Her face hardened when she saw him. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold as the wind. "Claire," he gasped, his words slurring through numb lips. "The baby. It's coming. The storm." "The storm didn't stop you from letting my Sarah die alone," she shot back, the grief of years making her voice a weapon. "Why should I go out in it for you and some stray you bought in town?" "Please," he begged, the word tearing from his frozen lungs. He sank to his knees on her porch, all his strength gone. "It's not for me. It's for the child. An innocent child. Don't let what happened to Sarah happen again. Don't let my failure be her fate." Martha stared down at the broken man at her feet. She saw the frost caking his beard, the desperation in his eyes, and something in her hardened heart finally cracked. The midwife in her, the part that honored new life above all else, won out over the grieving mother. "Lord have mercy," she muttered, grabbing her heavy coat and medical bag. "Get up, you fool. You'll do her no good frozen solid on my porch." The journey back was a nightmare. Twice they nearly went off the trail. Martha's horse, old but sure-footed, followed Jonah's, who was now moving on pure, desperate will. When they finally burst back into the cabin, dawn was a gray smear in the sky, and the storm was just beginning to break. They found Claire on the floor by the hearth, exhausted but conscious, a pile of torn sheeting beside her. "Thank God," Claire breathed, tears of relief freezing on her cheeks. Martha took charge instantly, her gruff demeanor a comfort. "You," she barked at Jonah, "keep that fire roaring and get water boiling. The rest you leave to me." The next hours were a maelstrom of pain, encouragement, and prayer. Jonah, though half frozen and exhausted, stayed by Claire's side, his hand a steady presence for her to grip. He murmured words of encouragement, his voice a low, constant rumble. And in the midst of it all, Claire saw him look at Martha, and saw Martha look back. And in their shared focus on the life struggling to be born, a silent, unspoken forgiveness passed between them. The old wound, while not gone, was finally being cleansed. And then, as the first rays of morning sun broke through the clouds and streamed through the window, a new sound filled the cabin, the strong, lusty cry of a healthy baby boy. "You have a son," Martha announced, her voice thick with emotion as she cleaned the infant. "A fine, strong boy." She wrapped him in a clean blanket and placed him in Claire's arms. He was perfect, a shock of dark hair, a tiny, scrunched-up face. He opened his eyes, and they were the deep, clear blue of a mountain lake after a storm. "Samuel," Claire whispered, the name coming to her as if it had always been there. "His name is Samuel." Jonah knelt beside the bed, his face a mess of emotions, awe, relief, joy, and a grief so profound it was heartbreaking. He reached out a trembling finger and touched the baby's cheek. "Samuel," he echoed, the name a prayer. He looked at Claire, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "It means God has heard," he said softly. Claire's free hand found his, their fingers lacing together. In that moment, they weren't a hermit and a stray. They were a family. But as the joy of the moment washed over them, a dark shadow fell across the doorway. One of Sloane's men stood there, his face grim. He had obviously waited for the storm to break. "Sloane sends his regard," the man said, his eyes cold. "He knows the baby's been born. He says to tell you he'll be coming to collect his property in 3 days." The warm, joyful bubble shattered. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The 3 days passed in a haze of surreal tranquility. The cabin, once a fortress, became a nursery. The air was filled with the scent of milk and clean linen. Samuel was a peaceful baby, his cries infrequent, his tiny fists curling around their fingers with surprising strength. Jonah finished the cradle he had been carving, sanding the wood until it was smooth as river stone, and they placed Samuel in it by the hearth. In these moments, watching their son sleep, it was almost possible to forget the threat that hung over them like a sharpened axe. But the peace was an illusion. Jonah slept in shifts, always with his rifle by his side. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They were living on borrowed time. Martha Winter stayed with them, her earlier animosity replaced by a fierce, grandmotherly protection of Samuel. She and Jonah spoke of Sarah, not with blame, but with a shared, quiet grief. A fragile peace was forged between them, a testament to the new life they had brought into the world together. On the morning of the third day, the air was still and cold. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. Henry Tall Elk, a Ute scout and a friend of Jonah's from years past, appeared silently at the edge of the woods. He had seen the gathering at Sloan's ranch. 10 men, Jonah, he reported, his face grave. All heavily armed. They ride at midday. The news settled like a stone in Claire's stomach. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling as she clutched Samuel tighter. We can't win a gunfight, Jonah said, his face grim. He looked at Martha, then at Henry. But we might not have to fight alone. He turned to Claire. There's a chance, a long one, but it's the only one we have. We have to go to the town. The town? Claire was incredulous. They turned their backs on me once. They fear Sloan. They fear him alone, Jonah said, a new idea taking shape in his eyes. Maybe they won't fear him together. Reverend Wickham. He's a man of God. His conscience must be worth something. It was a desperate gamble. They left Martha and Henry to guard the cabin and Samuel, a decision that tore Claire's heart in two. Every step away from her son felt like a betrayal. They rode down the mountain, not in the slow wagon, but on Jonah's fastest horses. The town of Silver Creek looked the same, but something had shifted. The stares they received were different now, less scornful, more curious, tinged with a nervous pity. News of Sloan's hired guns had trickled down from the mountains. They found Reverend Wickham in his study, surrounded by books. He looked up, his face etched with worry, when he saw Jonah's grim expression and Claire's tear-streaked face. He had clearly heard the rumors. Reverend, Jonah began, his voice leaving no room for argument. You spoke of mercy to me once, and I turned away. Now I am asking for it, not for myself, for my son. Barrett Sloan aims to take him today, with guns and force. He thinks because he is rich, he is above God's law. Are you going to prove him right? The direct challenge hung in the air. The preacher's face paled. He remembered the day he had ducked into the mercantile, leaving Claire to her fate. The shame of it was plain on his face. What? What can I do? He stammered. Sloan is powerful. You can be more powerful, Claire said, finding a strength she never knew she possessed. You can be a shepherd to your flock. You can remind them that there is a right and a wrong, and that standing by while a child is stolen is wrong. You can give them the courage they've lost. The Reverend stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a shamed girl, but as a fierce mother. And in that moment, something within him broke. His cowardice crumbled, and the man of God he was meant to be stood up. You are right, he said, his voice ringing with newfound conviction. He walked to the church and began to ring the bell. Not for his service, but as an alarm, a call to arms, its urgent peal echoing through the valley. People began to emerge from their homes and shops, drawn by the frantic sound. They gathered in the square, the same square where Claire had been sold. The Reverend stood on the church steps, Jonah and Claire beside him. He told them the story. He spoke of Sloan's greed, of his hired guns, of the baby in the cabin on the mountain. He spared no one, least of all himself. I failed this woman once, he thundered, pointing at Claire. I let my fear of a rich man outweigh my duty to God. I will not fail her again, and neither will you. A murmur went through the crowd. Tom Miller, the blacksmith, stepped forward. Sloan holds the loan on my smithy. If I cross him, he holds the loan on my store too, Mr. Peterson added, his voice shaking. One by one, they confessed their own chains. Sloan didn't just own the biggest ranch. He owned the town's debt. He owned their fear. But as they spoke their fears aloud, something shifted. The collective shame became a collective anger. Mrs. Peterson, who had once pulled her daughter away from Claire, now stepped forward, her face blazing. My husband says Sloan threatened to ruin us if we didn't vote his way for mayor. This has gone on long enough. A man's money doesn't give him the right to steal a baby. A roar of agreement went up. The fear, once a private burden, had become a public fury. It was a powder keg, and Claire's plight had been the spark. But just as the town's anger reached its peak, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the end of the street. It was Barrett Sloan and his 10 hired guns, riding into town like a conquering army. They had expected to ride up a mountain to fight a hermit. They hadn't expected the entire town to be waiting for them in the street. Sloan reined in his horse, a look of shocked fury on his face. What is the meaning of this? He snarled at the Reverend. This is the meaning, Mr. Sloan, the Reverend said, his voice calm and clear. This is a community finding its soul. You will not pass. Sloan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You and what army, preacher? He gestured to his men who raised their rifles. The crowd wavered. Anger was one thing, but rifle barrels were another. This one, a voice said. And from the alley beside the mercantile, Henry Tall Elk stepped out, and behind him another dozen Ute warriors, their faces grim, armed with bows and rifles. Jonah Briggs is a friend to our people, Henry said, his voice quiet but carrying immense authority. We do not let our friends be bullied. Sloan's face went white. He had planned for a hermit. He was now facing a town in the Ute Nation. But the final, devastating blow was yet to come. Jonah stepped forward. He wasn't holding a rifle. He was holding a tattered, yellowed piece of paper. This here is the original deed to my land, Sloan, he said, his voice ringing with power. Signed and sealed 30 years ago. It includes full water rights to the creek that feeds your entire northern pasture. Sloan stared at him, uncomprehending. That means, Jonah continued, letting the truth land like a hammer blow, that I can legally dam that creek tomorrow. Your prize cattle will be dead of thirst in a week. Now you can try to take my son. You might even succeed. But I promise you, you will lose everything you actually care about. Your ranch will be a boneyard. Checkmate. The silence was absolute. Sloan looked at the angry faces of the townspeople he controlled. He looked at the silent, deadly Ute warriors. He looked at Jonah, a man he had dismissed as a broken hermit, now holding the power to ruin him. He looked at the deed in Jonah's hand, and he broke. The arrogance, the fury, the power, it all drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow, defeated man. It's over, he whispered, the words meant for himself. He turned his horse, and without another word to his men or the town, he rode away, his hired guns trailing behind him in confused silence. A massive cheer erupted from the crowd. People were crying, hugging, laughing. Claire fell into Jonah's arms, sobbing with relief. They had won, not with bullets, but with truth, courage, and a community that had finally remembered how to stand together. They rode back up the mountain, not as outcasts, but as heroes, with the whole town cheering them on. When they reached the cabin, Martha met them on the porch, holding a sleeping Samuel. She placed the baby back in Claire's arms. Welcome home, she said, her eyes shining. Claire looked down at her son, then at Jonah, his strong arm around her. She looked at the cabin, her sanctuary. She looked at the mountain, her home. Her father had sold her as a punishment, but what he did, what the town did, what Sloan did, it had all led to this. An unexpected mercy, an unbreakable love, a family forged in fire. And as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of hope, she knew that the single silver dollar hadn't been a price. It had been a promise of a new beginning, in the last place on earth she ever expected to find it. Stories like this remind us that courage isn't about the absence of fear. It's about standing up when you're terrified. It's about a community realizing that their combined voices are stronger than any bully's threats. It shows that the greatest families are often the ones we build, not the ones we're born into. If stories of courage, justice, and unexpected hope are what you look for, you've found the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we've got a new story just like this one coming tomorrow. Thanks for watching.